Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Kenny McBride and joining me tonight is Gary Patterson. Gary, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Well, excellent to have you in the studio tonight. And in our first story, Transport Secretary Michael Matheson today confirmed that the Abellio ScotRail contract will come to an early end in 2022. The current franchise agreement is a 10-year deal, but it requires Scottish ministers and Abellio to revisit the level of government subsidy provided for the remaining 5 years of the contract, and to determine whether additional subsidy should be paid in a process known as rebasing. After analysing the information provided by Abellio, ministers have decided that the significant increase in government subsidy proposed would not deliver commensurate benefits to passengers, communities and the economy. Ministers have therefore served a no rebasing notice on Abellio ScotRail. As a result, existing government subsidy levels will remain in place and the franchise will come to an early end in March of 2022. The Scottish Government has previously indicated that its preference would be for a public sector operator to take over the franchise at the earliest possible date and fought for that power to be included in the 2016 Scotland Act. Michael Matheson said, "Our rail network is of significant social, economic and environmental value to the people of Scotland, and ministers must ensure that the services we secure are high-performing, financially sustainable and offer value for money. We currently provide around 2/3 of the running costs for our railway, and it is essential that this is sustainable going forward. Our record investment in rail is already delivering more seats, more trains and more stations. Any changes to the level of subsidy paid by the government must deliver new benefits for passengers and taxpayers, and while there have been improvements in recent years, the proposed changes were not sufficient to justify additional subsidy." And Scottish Greens Transport spokesperson John Finney also welcomed the news, saying, "Scottish Greens welcome the decision to bring an end to the Abellio ScotRail franchise. Delays, cancellations and overcrowding have occurred far too often on Scotland's railways in recent years. The Scottish Government must now ensure that a robust public sector bid is in place so that our railways can be run in the public interest in future, rather than for private profit as now." So Gary, what do you make of this news?
Well, I think it's the correct decision. I think people are, not just in Scotland but across the UK, quite tired now of the privatisation system. And I think whilst Abellio made quite a lot of promises of different provisions that they could install, which were supposed to be similar to things that they do within their own state-run railways. As has been noted, there's been a number of issues. In fairness to Abellio, I would say one of the things that's often cited as well is that the actual railways operating as a franchise and the actual rail track side of the thing being separate, that is something that should be resolved in future. So I think it's really important that people can have faith in the railways again, and that actually the government is running these vital public services. But it's really important as well that it's not just a franchising bid, but that there's actually the powers are devolved fully to the Scottish Parliament, so that we can actually take the railways fully back into ownership and not simply run a public private franchise.
Yeah. I mean, that was something else that Michael Matheson said in his statement. I didn't quote the full speech. He did say that their hope was that they could bring the whole operation in house. I mean, it does. Nobody ever has thought it made sense at the time. I mean, I don't know if you're probably not quite old enough to remember British Rail being sold off, but at the time, there were people saying this doesn't make sense, having the tracks owned by one person and the trains run by another.
And also the carriages are owned separately as well. So there's so many different aspects of it which just doesn't work. If you speak to ScotRail or you speak to Network Rail, they tend to seem to blame each other as well. Yeah. And that indicates to me that there's not a lot of communication between the two as well. So I think it's high time that it's all brought back together as a government-run provision for the public, and that Scotland could lead the way to show the rest of the UK, but also that it's not something unusual actually for the majority of European countries, including the owners of Abellio, or the Dutch National Railway. It is the case that it's publicly run, and the cost of travel abroad is far cheaper. The standards tend to be far higher as well. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, and I think people are expecting to see something bold at the end of this project.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the very great ironies that we have. They're Dutch, aren't they, Abellio? We have a Dutch public sector operator running our railways when we can't have our own public sector.
But it's the case for almost every operator in the UK. They're being run by national rail operators from other countries, France, Germany, etc. And the cost and standard of provision is not to a standard that they would be able to get away with running in their own countries. That suggests to me that publicly accountable services, where it's things like railways, that's the best option.
Yeah, I mean, I think the accountability argument is maybe the most interesting one, given that, as you say, there's often this kind of, well, it's Railtrack's fault, it's the operator's fault, it's the carriage licensing company's fault. You know, bringing them all together, ideally, should, you would think, make a more efficient system. But yeah, it's certainly good news. I mean, one thing that has been consistent for years now is that even a majority of Tory voters support public ownership of the railways. And until recently, the SNP were the only party in Britain really calling for that. So do you think there is hope that maybe down south we're hearing more sort of economic populist language from Boris Johnson? Do you think there's a possibility that maybe they do decide to follow suit at some point?
Well, it depends now, because he's got his majority locked in until the next half decade, so he can do whatever he wants with that. And if he feels that that's something that he's able to push through, then he will. If he wants to do it, that is, or maybe he will continue to side, as the Tories often do, side with more corporate interests rather than on those matters. But what's very clear is that the way that the current rail system is operating, there's huge public dissatisfaction, people have real lack of faith, and whilst things have been challenging at times in Scotland, when you travel around the railway in places like Northern England and you see the standard of they're using these old carriages that were converted from buses, and they're actually of a lower quality of the railways in North Korea, I've seen famously said online. Wow. And it just shows you that first of all, the complete lack of parity of standards across the UK is really unfair, so that people that are living in one part of the country get a really substandard service, whereas others maybe don't. That's something that really needs to change as well. There should already be minimum standards, but people are extremely dissatisfied, I think, and this is one area that perhaps the UK will find parity with the rest of Europe on, despite leaving.
Well, we can only hope. Anyway, moving on. The chief statistician today released statistics showing that the economy in Scotland grew by 0.3% during the third quarter of 2019, covering that period from July to September. During the third quarter, output in the construction sector remained flat, output in production grew by 0.9%, and output in the services sector grew by 0.2%. Scotland's gross domestic product grew by 0.3% in real terms during the third quarter of 2019, rebounding from a contraction in quarter two. Compared to the same quarter last year, Scotland's GDP grew by 0.7%, but the pace of growth was slower than in 2018. Finance Secretary Derek Mackay said, while it is good news the economy has grown in the last quarter, it is unsurprising the overall pace of growth has slowed as a result of the continued uncertainty around Brexit. Scotland has a strong economic foundation with a lower unemployment rate than the UK, and we will continue to do all we can to stimulate growth, jobs and investment and help build economic resilience. However, Brexit remains the biggest threat to our economy. Scotland did not vote for Brexit, and the people of Scotland have the right to determine their own future free from Brexit as an independent member of the European Union. We are focused on delivering a stronger economy and will be renewing our economic action plan in the new year. So this is small growth, but growth, as it said, it's a wee rebound from a dip that we had in quarter two. So there has been some growth, which is generally considered a positive. What do you make of these statistics then?
Well, I just hope it's not the last growth that we see for a while. Obviously, the political environment is moving very rapidly now in the new year. It does look like we will withdraw from the EU on the 31st of January, though there would be a transition period for the rest of the year, so potentially the statistics won't change much in that time. But for an economy like Scotland, which is so export heavy, it's really focused on the food and drink sector in particular, we're already getting a bit of a flavour of what a post-Brexit environment would look like, thanks to the United States' ability to implement some temporary tariff restrictions on European goods, and they have went straight for items like Scotch whisky, etc. And we know that some of the big targets within the trade deals that are coming up in the next well, how many years, we don't know. Yeah. But whisky, for example, the protected status of those items as well, of Scottish produce, these are all up for debate, all up for trade, actually. The evidence that we've seen so far around Brexit doesn't look very promising. So it's great to see some small positive development in terms of the economy, but the future looks pretty risky.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I did find interesting there was that there was an increase in production, which essentially in manufacturing, which is something that we reported last night, actually, is down across the UK. So anything where we're doing well there, anything where we have an edge over the rest of the UK is always going to be some sort of good news. But you're quite right. Obviously, Brexit poses a whole lot of challenges. We've had Ruth on from Keep Scotland the Brand a number of times recently, and I mean, she's really been kind of raising the alarm about these protected statuses that without EU protection become, as you say, bargaining chips with other countries. It would be very good I'm sure, for the American whiskey industry to be able to put Scotch on bottles of their own produce. What do you think? I mean, we are going to talk a little bit more about Brexit shortly, but how big an impact do you see it having? I mean, you're not in business yourself, but are you hearing from people? Do you talk to people who are kind of concerned about the business impact of Brexit?
Well, I think from what you see in terms of from businesses is the main thing is uncertainty. And the one thing about Brexit is that get Brexit done is a really nice slogan, but it doesn't actually mean anything in practice, and the uncertainty will not be gone away. There's a whole year of negotiations. Actually, the original withdrawal agreement, it was supposed to be 2 years, but there was a fixed date. So it was up to December 2020. So there'll be 11 months of negotiations. Throughout that whole time, there won't be certainty on what form of what they call a future relationship, how that EU-UK relationship is going to look. And then, of course, even once Brexit is done and dusted, if you can imagine such a thing, that uncertainty still won't be there that certainty will still not be there, because all of these trade negotiations that need to be made with different countries from around the world. Now, you can have a quick and fast trade negotiation if you're prepared to accept anything. If you want to hammer out a deal, if you want to actually negotiate, it can take anything from 5 years to a decade. The Canada-EU trade deal actually took 6 years to negotiate, and that's because you can get a quick trade deal if you want something which is not necessarily going to be great in your favour. So for each of these trade negotiations that are going to be going on, the question about things like whisky, Scottish produce, etc., they'll come up every single time. You've just completed a trade negotiation with one country, move on to the next one, they want to talk about whisky. So that's something for our sectors. It means that the certainty is not really going to come back, unless, of course, we do choose a different economic path.
Yeah, I mean, it is a long road. It's something that the Tories especially have taken great pains not to tell people. During the election, it was all, we're going to get Brexit done, it's going to be over and done with by January, and then as soon as the election results were in, it was, this is going to be years of further negotiations, but that's what you get for listening to Tories, I'm afraid. In other economic news in Scotland, new statistics from the annual population survey have been released, which show that 336,000 young people aged 16 to 24 years were in employment in Scotland in October 2018 to September 2019. The employment rate for young people was 59%, higher than a year ago when this figure stood at 57.9%. In the same period, 34,000 young people aged 16 to 24 were unemployed. The unemployment rate for young people was 9.1%, lower than a year ago when it was sat at 9.5%. And in the same period, 199,000 young people were economically inactive. That economic inactivity rate for young people was 35%, which is also a fall from last year when it was 36.1%. So this is broadly good news. I think any decline in unemployment, any decline in economic activity is good news. And so speaking as a young person, representative of all young people across Scotland.
You got me in just before I turned 30. So.
What do you think of these results?
Well, yeah, I think these are obviously specifically looking at the labour market, and it's fair to note that there's a wider picture of people that are in work, that are in education, training and other things. But the overall youth unemployment rate in Scotland is one of the lowest in Europe, and I think that's testament to the efforts that's been made by the Scottish Government on things like free education at university, huge agenda on widening access, something I come from myself as from deprived background, and I went through college, uni, now postgraduate as well. But these are looking specifically at quite a specific age group of 16 to 24, so the ones that are coming out of school and potentially not going on to further or higher education. Yeah. So again, it all links back into the economic kind of picture as well, and what's really important is that this is a generation that is going to have to handle quite a lot of problems that are being hung over from previous decades. The climate crisis is something that this generation is going to have to live through and deal with. The political uncertainty that we have internationally and with the UK as well. So it's really important that we give these young people the best start that they can get, and that is through whatever opportunity they want to do, be that to work, be that to go through further training, study and education. There needs to be funding and support and provision for them. So all the signs show that it seems to be a positive provision. I noted as well that those that are unemployed, the figure is halved from what it was in 2012 as well. So that's positive. But any young person that's being left behind, that can create massive issues further down the line for that individual, most importantly, but also for the society as well. So it's really important that young people are given the opportunity to try things out. If it doesn't work out, that they don't find that there's only one chance, there's only one path to go down. And with things like limited funding to do certain courses, sometimes there's a high pressure on young people to feel that they have to get things right. And I've not had that myself. Like, I've done an apprenticeship baking at one point. I've been to college. I've worked in retail. Like, I've done all these different things, and sometimes you have went down a wee path and say, actually, that's not necessarily for me. So I think it's really important that young people are given the support to be a little bit creative and find what works for them, and that there is always funding and assistance there, so that they can be supported.
Absolutely. So, back in Brussels, the traditional end-of-year European fishery negotiations have concluded with agreement on a range of quotas and management measures. But the talks, which are potentially Scotland's last as a member of the EU, took place in the context of challenging scientific advice. Combined with other recent agreements between the EU, the Faroes and Norway, which were ratified in Brussels, there are a number of tough outcomes for the Scottish fleet. Following the talks, Fisheries Secretary Fergus Ewing expressed disappointment that with Brexit in mind, the EU seems already to be prioritising other members' interests ahead of Scotland's. Key points of the agreement include total allowable catch for West of Scotland cod reduced by 26% in line with the scientific advice, but without the arbitrary additional 20% cut that had originally been proposed. Ratification of the 50% decrease in North Sea cod, agreed between the EU and Norway last week, but a 5% increase of the catch allowed for North Sea ling and a 5% increase for North Sea skate and rays as well. And there's also been a relaxation of some of the proposed control and management measures. So, I mean, that's a big cut, 50% decrease in North Sea cod. A big cut for the North Sea fleet. The Scottish Fishermen's Federation spoke today saying that this was, really going to be a challenging one that was going to hit them quite hard. So what do you think about this? Is fishing something you're an expert on?
I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an expert on fishing, but I do follow the negotiations around the Common Fisheries Policy. First of all, it is quite a huge drop, the 50%. It's fair to note that that's specifically within cod, and that it's not all fishing overall. So in fact, some have actually increased. I didn't see it in the statistics that you covered there, but I'd read it earlier today that I believe it was in Haddock or something that had increased actually something along the lines of 28%. So fundamentally, the reason why the CFP exists is not to punish people. It's literally because if we do overfish the oceans and the seas, there's not going to be any fish left. So at least the premise of it is a good premise, but Scotland has not been very well represented within the process throughout, before Brexit as well. The Scottish Government has had quite a lot of success and expertise on maritime issues and has been able to go along to some of these things as part of a UK delegation, though it's not uncommon for there to be no UK minister, which means that the Scottish ministers can't attend in issues like this, or the Scottish minister has not been able to be nominated to take the seat to represent the wider UK. I think this is one area, certainly with the EU, where I would expect, if we were to vote for independence, as I hope we will, and we were to engage with Europe on our own accession as a member state, this will clearly be one of the areas where Scotland will seek to push some interest. But certainly to make sure that we're actually properly represented at these discussions, we need to have independence and we need to have our seat at the table. Now what we're going to have is not even being able to observe and be present at the CFP. We're going to be, as they're saying, an independent coastal nation, which actually means that it will be London making the decisions, and our fishermen have been sold out a lot sooner than the actual Brexit vote completing, and quite a lot of the fishermen appear to be quite disappointed from what we've been seeing over the last couple of years. But also preceding being in the EU as well, London has always been quick to sell out these fishing interests as well. So I think it's extremely important that we find something that works to maintain sustainable fishing, but also works to the economic interests of those communities and fishermen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the part of the reduction in the North Sea catch for cod, I understand, is because climate change is already affecting where the cod tend to be. That's becoming an increasing problem for fishing communities all over the world.
Of course, as well, something that I'd only just recently became aware of is that there's quite a strong difference of opinion within the Scottish fishing community as well, and that actually if you speak to fishermen on the West Coast, they have a completely different perspective when it comes to Brexit, the CFP, and general sustainability, and I think it does come down to a thing about it's about localism as well. So that's probably one thing that needs to be looked at as well, is that when we're actually engaging, be that through the current setup with CFP in Brussels, or be the Boris setup, which will be with London in the future, or if it's with independence decided with the Scottish Government, that there's a high degree of localism within the decision making, that we're actually engaging with those communities and that they don't feel that these are decisions that are being taken in far-flung places that they're not actually able to be included in. It's really important as well that the economic strategy for their communities also includes of other methods that assist those that are not necessarily involved in fishing, or people that are feeling that potentially that's the only thing that their town has, for example, that needs to improve the economic diversity of those areas, so they're not just dependent on one sector.
Absolutely. So also still at sea, kind of, Economy Secretary Derek Mackay has given an update to Parliament today on the Ferguson Marine Shipyard, which has now been taken into full public ownership. Mr. Mackay outlined details from a new report which looks at the overall state of the business. The report provides the latest information on the 2 public sector ferries being built at the yard, including design issues, quality control and management processes in the business prior to it going into administration. The additional cost to complete the two ferries is now thought to be somewhere between £95 and £100 million, which includes the management and operation costs of the yard. The MV Glen Sannox, which will operate on the Ardrossan to Brodick route, is now expected to be delivered between October and December of 2021. The second vessel, which will operate on the Uig to Tarbert and Lochmaddy route, is expected in July to October of 2022. Mr Mackay said, "We have been working for over 2 years to find a resolution on the difficulties at Ferguson Marine, and our priorities still remain the completion of the two public sector ferries, protecting jobs and securing a long-term future for the yard." This report highlights why public ownership was the only option open to us to deliver these outcomes and why it was the right thing for the Scottish Government to step in when we did. While there is a lot of hard work to be done, the alternative for the Scottish Government was to walk away, which would have resulted in hundreds of job losses, the yard's closure and our vital ferries not being finished. I am not willing to walk away. So, I mean, good news certainly for the workers at Ferguson there, and obviously these two ships are now going to be produced in Scotland. What do you make of this report, though, on the circumstances that brought it into public ownership?
Well, it's very important that the Scottish Government has been in a position to intervene and stop that from falling apart, and it's one of the issues that has been a problem in Scottish economy in decades past, where by the central government had basically failed in their role to manage the economy, and they failed to step in and support sectors that were actually at risk of collapsing, and of course we've seen what that done to the Scottish society for decades. So it's really important that we have a reactive government in Edinburgh that is able to step in and provide support so that those jobs could be saved. And whilst it's still a lot of work to do with Ferguson Marine, as has been noted, the work has been completed and the contracts are being delivered, and those ferries are going to be a great asset in Scotland. And it does show that at least there are challenges, but it's been the right decision to take to actually resolve this matter and to step in and provide some assistance.
Yeah, well, in some other maritime news, shipping companies would have to pay a small levy on every tonne of fuel they use under proposals aimed at developing zero-carbon vessels within 10 years to transform the high-carbon global shipping business. Ships running on hydrogen or ammonia as fuel are thought to be technically possible, but more research and development is needed to bring forward the development of prototypes. The International Chamber of Shipping, which represents 80% of the global shipping industry, is proposing a $2 levy on every tonne of fuel consumed by ships, raising $500 million a year that would be devoted to research and development of zero-carbon vessels. And I mean, is this the kind of opportunity that you think Ferguson's could be pursuing?
Sure, but I think just generally, as it's looking at a global picture, 500 million, it sounds impressive, but it doesn't actually sound like a lot to me when you're talking about it being a global picture, and perhaps they need to look at being a bit bolder and more ambitious. When it comes to the climate crisis, this is not something that's in the future anymore. This is something that people in our lifetimes, or at least for my generation, we are going to live through the effects of this, and certainly for our children, they're going to have to go through what may be the outcome of it. So across all sectors, but specifically within shipping, we do need to be bolder. We need to be more ambitious about tackling the climate crisis, and it is a crisis. We need to stop referring to it as climate change now, because it's not a strong enough term to actually reflect what's actually happening. It's a full-on crisis that's been declared by the European Parliament, been declared by declared by the UK government, and of course the Scottish government as well. So certainly the concept I agree with, but I do think it needs to be much bolder, much stronger.
Yeah, there were some criticisms of this from environmental groups. The ICS said that it was kept low so that developing countries would see it as affordable, but would still raise money that they could put into research. I think there's a very good chance you're right that more will be necessary.
Well, the funny thing is, actually, we've just come out of a climate conference in Madrid just in the last week there, and it's actually been the developing or smaller countries that have been asking the developed or larger countries of the world to take a more bolder target. This is obviously setting climate targets overall, but it does seem to be that the larger economies are the ones that tend to be a bit less ambitious, it seems, in relation to this. So I think that's it's something that needs to be addressed. But these companies that are involved in this, the actual industry as well, it's a huge contributor to climate change, or the climate crisis, as I said. And whilst we can do our bit by recycling and amending little aspects of our life about how we eat and fly, etc., and it is important. But fundamentally, the main thing is we need to really target those huge, massive contributors to the climate crisis, so that we can meet that issue head on. Then they are responsible, so they need to play a role in it.
Absolutely, and it should be pointed out, one of those vessels that is being built at Ferguson is partially powered by hydrogen. So we're already kind of starting to take those steps. It would be a tragedy certainly if we lost those skills in Scotland.
Scotland as a leader in climate ambition, we do have the potential not just to tap that resource where it is an energy resource, but also to bring that ambition to the fore in our our economic provision as well. So it is the right time for this kind of effort.
And it is somewhere where having a public sector involvement can make a difference. Absolutely. Because the goal isn't just to make profits. There's some
that might
other goal.
That might be the case as well. That it might not necessarily be the most profitable outcome, and that's maybe not the only way to look at how a state-owned company such as like Ferguson Marine is actually contributing. Because even if it was to run at a small loss, it's providing jobs. But if it was fulfilling a particular mission and purpose, which is tackling the climate crisis with an actual industry approach, it's a great asset for Scotland's wider contribution to fighting the climate crisis.
And in Westminster today, Ian Blackford has been unanimously re-elected as SNP's Westminster Group Leader for the new Parliament at today's AGM, following the landslide victory at the general election, which saw the SNP win 80% of Scottish seats on a mandate for an independence referendum. The SNP MP for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, who increased his own majority at the general election to 9,443 with 48.3% of the vote, said the SNP was now the only strong, united and focused opposition to Boris Johnson's extreme Tory government and devastating Brexit plans, with Labour consumed by bitter infighting and division. Kirsty Blackman has also been re-elected as SNP Deputy Westminster Leader. The MP for Aberdeen North, who increased her majority at the election to 12,670 with an incredible 54% of the vote, said SNP MPs would stand up for the decision of voters to back a fresh referendum on independence and take the Tories on over their appalling record on austerity and child poverty. And meanwhile, Emily Thornberry today officially announced that she is entering the race to succeed Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. The Shadow Foreign Secretary set out her pitch to be the next leader in an article for The Guardian, arguing that she's already pummeled Boris Johnson across the dispatch box and knows how to exploit his failings. Directly addressing those calling for a new leader from the north of England, she made the case that Corbyn's replacement should be chosen on the basis of their political nous and strategic vision rather than where they come from or their views on Brexit. Her declaration makes her the first candidate to confirm that she wants to be in the race, although Lisa Nandy, Keir Starmer, Clive Lewis and David Lammy have all said that they're considering it. Rebecca Long-Bailey, who is backed by a number of Corbyn allies, is also very likely to stand, along with Jess Phillips and potentially Yvette Cooper. Thornberry and Starmer both served in Corbyn's shadow cabinet alongside Long-Bailey, but Nandy, on the other hand, has been on the backbenches since she resigned in 2016 when Corbyn's leadership was first challenged. The leadership contest will start formally in January and last until Corbyn steps down at the end of March. So, no change for the SNP, all change at the head of the Labour Party. What do you think about, well, both stories really?
Well, first of all, I think it's wonderful to see the number of SNP MPs that have been elected. Each of them have their own particular stories individually of things that they've done in their constituencies, whether it be Alison Fewis on things like the rape clause and safe consumption rooms, we're in Glasgow Central here, or a number of MPs from across Scotland that have done amazing things in their own constituencies. So just on that personal level, like I'm really pleased to see that people will still have great constituency MPs that will be able to fight their corner, and that's going to be absolutely necessary, because in the time ahead, however longer we're going to be still part of this Parliament and this Union, it's going to be really important that Scotland has MPs down there that can, first of all, as was said in the election, was quite a clear position to say, if we can stop Brexit, that'll be the main priority. But if that wasn't to be the case, if England was to elect a majority Conservative government, as it has done, then it would have been absolutely crucial for us to have had that mandate and that huge majority to send a message that Scotland needs to have a choice on the steps ahead when it comes to Brexit. As an aside, I've noticed that not only all the political parties in Westminster, but actually the campaigns that were set up to oppose Brexit, they've all shut down now. The Lib Dems have said they need to accept the result of the elections. UK and Scottish Labour are also saying that we need to accept Brexit. So what's happening now within British politics is it's a complete revamp. All of the old players, apart from Boris, are moving on. And also we're now taking Brexit as a given. And that means that if you're pro-European, if you're anti-Brexit, you're going to find that there's only one party in mainstream UK politics, which is obviously out of the big four parties. Only the SNP will be the party that is continuing to fight for remaining in Europe. And one of the manifestations we're seeing of that is that the Google search term "how to move to Scotland" has been spiking across the UK, and those who still have a hope to remain in Europe may find themselves moving to Scotland to vote for independence, and then to vote to be into Europe, and of course to be very welcome. In terms of Labour, it's a really interesting position to find themselves in again, because Corbyn has more or less survived over the last number of years without the internal debates about trying to get rid of him, and all that now seems to be coming back out again. I don't see, I could be wrong, but I don't see within the candidates any kind of people-powered candidate, someone that people can get really excited about in the way that they did about Corbyn. And you could say what you want about Corbyn, but he certainly did have a kind of a wider appeal out with mainstream English politics, which was just in London and just in Westminster. And I don't get
thousands and thousands of new members into the party.
Indeed, and I'm not getting that impression from I think the front runner probably is Keir Hardie and people like
Keir Starmer.
Keir Hardie.
I think they're quite a long way from.
Yeah. It's been a long day. Yeah, Keir Starmer. Well, he might be able to pull back a renaissance of the Hardie times. But I think the main thing is as well that Labour really won't have a chance now for another 5 years to actually put its message back out to people in a UK general election. And I think the UK is going to look radically different by the time they get a chance again to form a government. And it's just absolutely bizarre as well that after 10 years of quite an appalling UK government, that they've been given the prize of a 15-year government, which is unheard of. It's just very disappointing to see. So really, I hope that now we can coalesce around this national discussion that we need to have in Scotland. We've given the UK enough time now to let them have the debate on Brexit. And they've now made a clear decision on what they want to do. But that doesn't mean that Scotland has to just accept that and get into a box. We need to have a national debate now in this country about what our options will be.
Yeah, it's almost like Scotland's vote should be respected.
It's what we were told in the...
We're told so often that we have to respect votes, but Scotland, of course, did vote to remain, and the SNP, as you say, are the party that are still fighting to respect that vote. So.
Well, just if I can say briefly as well, like I've noticed some of the debates saying, if we got a 45% vote share, and they're saying, well, it wasn't quite an overall majority. Yet no British government since World War II has managed to have a 45% majority. So if this is the main majority which is a few points less that Boris can say that he can push for Brexit on. But the second point as well is to say that obviously I believe that everyone should vote SNP and that the SNP is the party for independence, but it is a fact that the independence movement is actually a lot bigger than just the SNP as a party. We're probably the biggest chunk of it, but you know, we've seen plenty of promotional materials from the Scottish Labour Party where they said that they had Yes activists involved in their campaign and that they said it wasn't about independence. So actually, some of the polling we've seen around parties suggests that up to half of Labour's voters are actually pro-independence. So if you put the numbers together on that, I think you get a clear indication of where we are, which is to say, at the very least, we're definitely in line with what polls are saying, which is it's 50-50 knife edge, perhaps even more.
Well, I mean, speaking from personal experience, I know people who voted Labour and are pro-independence. I know one person who definitely voted Yes in 2014 and was a candidate for Labour this time around. So
this is the thing to say as well,
right. I think
is you have to be cautious that if you are thinking about voting for a party, it's down to people who they want to vote for, that's their choice. But if you're going to, as they say, lend your vote to a party, you need to be aware as well, if that party is a unionist party and you're pro-independence, that they're going to use your vote against you in the very month after the actual vote. And of course, the very next day, Scotland and Union, former Labour MSP, who runs the operation, is taking those votes that might have been given from independence supporters that also supported Corbyn, and they've used that to say that there's only 45%.
While furiously arguing that people who voted SNP didn't really want to vote for didn't really want to vote on independence.
If we had a justification to have the national debate last time with a 22% support in favour, the fact that it's 45 or 50%, clearly there's a question that needs to be addressed here.
Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, again in Brussels, Ursula von der Leyen has warned that a cliff-edge Brexit at the end of 2020 will hurt the UK more than the EU, as she laid out her intentions to make the most out of the extremely challenging 11 months available to strike a trade deal. The European Commission President acknowledged the danger of time running out during the negotiations, a risk many fear has been amplified by Boris Johnson's decision to legislate to block an extension at the end of the transition period. Should the UK leave the EU on the 31st of January, as Brussels now assumes, the country will remain in the customs union and single market until the 31st of December next year, at which point any newly negotiated arrangements on issues like trade, security and fisheries will come into force. Boris Johnson has said he will not take up the opportunity to agree to an extension under any circumstances before the 1st of July, which is a deadline set in the withdrawal agreement. EU diplomats had been informed on Tuesday by the European Commission that there was no legal basis to agree an extension any later than that date. Von der Leyen said, in case we cannot conclude an agreement by the end of 2020, we will face again a cliff-edge situation, and this would clearly harm our interests. But it will impact the UK more than us, as the EU will continue benefiting from its single market, its customs union, and the 70 international agreements we signed with our partners. But it's clearly not in our interest. So this really goes back to what you were saying earlier. The negotiations are going to be difficult, and if there's no extension possible beyond the 1st of July, Boris Johnson only really needs to get past that date ultimately to get the hard deal, the hard Brexit that many people believe he actually wants.
The thing that Boris Johnson, I think, is forgetting is that it's a negotiation. So he's looking at his majority and he's saying, I can force anything I want through Parliament. But that's not the sum total of the discussion. He can't just set the parameters of the debate and then turn up to the other 27 leaders of the European countries and say, well, this is the only outcome that we can have because I've already legislated for it in my parliament. Well, they can say, well, we've done the same. We'll legislate it in our parliaments as well. So it's going to be a pretty tough period, I think, because it's supposed to be a 24-month negotiation period. They call it a transition period because it is transitioning out of the EU, but it's also a negotiation period, and that's been reduced down to 11 months. The one thing that probably will work in his favour is the fact that there seems to be no space now for debate within British politics on this. He has a huge majority. He can do what he wants with that. But in terms of the actual process, a deal can be done in 11 months, absolutely, but it just won't necessarily be a good deal. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that if you want to do a quick deal and race something through, it's like if you go into a bank and you buy insurance or something, and you can buy it quickly if you want, or if you want to sit down and actually read the terms and conditions and then find out if you actually got a good deal. So this is the thing as well, is that the EU, once the UK is left, it won't have any reason to act in the UK's interests. It'll be a third country. Now, they have said that the UK would never be entirely treated as a complete European entity. There'll be an appreciation and respect for the fact that it's a very close and important neighbour. But at the same time, there will be other priorities that people in their countries they'll be looking for, and they have to be reactive to them as well. So
yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we were talking about on the fishing negotiations.
Yeah.
That Fergus Ewing said specifically that it seemed like the EU was already kind of looking past Britain's interests and looking at, well, we've got 27 people here that we're going to have to be getting something out of this next year, when the UK won't be part of the negotiations.
It's a tough environment out there in the international trading environment in terms of actual regimes of governments and trading blocs. And the UK will have to, I don't think it's big enough to be its own entity. It will have to go into the orbit of something, and it looks like it's moving towards the United States. They're trying to go for this kind of Singapore-style model, which, by the way, is a low-tax, low-wage economy, is what they talk about there. I don't think that chimes with a lot of people's ambitions. But the UK will start to find itself a little bit lost, I think, in between China, Europe and America is the big three, or the BRIC countries as well. We'll start to struggle as it is if it had plenty of time to make negotiations, but the fact is that they want to do this in a really fast manner as well. I think it's quite concerning, but it does seem that one of the main models that they're pursuing is really like this kind of tax haven-esque style economy that they want to, they're talking about having like free ports where they have like tax-free arenas where people can come into the country basically and trade for nothing. So it'll be kind of a same as usual neoliberal perspective that they'll take, and they seem to have fallen quite in with the hardline right wing with the American Republicans. So it's extremely alien to the political climate, not just in Scotland but in lots of parts of the UK as well. So it's going to be a bumpy few months, but it's certainly not get Brexit done.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the United States, in Washington today, the House of Representatives began debate ahead of historic votes on 2 charges against President Donald Trump, accusing him of abusing his power and obstructing Congress that would make him only the 3rd US president ever to be impeached. The votes in the Democratic-controlled House are expected to fall entirely along party lines, underscoring the deep divide in Congress over the Republican president's conduct and the larger political schism within the US. Impeachment is an extraordinary check on presidential power spelled out in the US Constitution, enabling Congress to remove presidents who commit high crimes and misdemeanors. The vote, which is expected early in the evening, would set the stage for a trial next month in the US Senate on whether to convict him and remove him from office. The House has twice previously voted to impeach presidents, Andrew Johnson in 1868 and Bill Clinton in 1998, but no president has ever been removed from office via impeachment. Richard Nixon resigned in August 1974 rather than face impeachment. However, the Senate is controlled by Trump's fellow Republicans, who seem unlikely to find him guilty regardless of any evidence presented. More than 20 of them would need to join the Democrats in finding Trump guilty for impeachment to be successful. So is this a story you've been following much?
Yeah. So the main premise of the allegation is that the United States, the president in office, has used the office of the State Department, it's effectively the American Foreign Office, to request intel from the Ukrainian government into candidates. This whole process, as you've correctly said, it will fall down on party lines. The House of the House of Representatives, the lower house, they're likely, I think, to start the proceedings in the Senate, but the Senate is controlled by the Republicans. Now, this is a president that's already bragged about sexual assault, a president that's been involved in many business and political scandals as it is. In simpler times, I think he would have been impeached, but he wouldn't be in office in the first place. But it's quite sad that we're in this kind of political environment where he can pretty much do what he wants and be untouchable. So it does seem that the Senate will not under any circumstances actually remove him from office. And a lot of this has been seen as a kind of pretext and a build-up to the upcoming presidential election, in which it seems that Trump will also be standing again.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very strange decision, I think, for the Democrats. I mean, I understand the impulse to try and rein Donald Trump in, but they have known from the beginning that this was going to be a losing effort. They've known that they were going to get to the Senate and it was going to fall apart. And yet they're bringing this up in January, right before the primary voting in the Democratic nomination process for the presidential election. Starts in the first week of February, and now several of the leading candidates are going to be in the Senate every day for the trial, discussing Joe Biden, who's one of the other leading candidates. It does seem like a very odd political decision for them. Do you think it is just that they felt, this was a line that couldn't be crossed and they had to finally take a stand?
I mean, it is very extreme to have your office of state to be involved in election gathering purposes, to be firing key staff for not taking orders to act in unlawful means, and it's extremely problematic, especially after the previous election with allegations of foreign involvement in the elections, to be utilising the US foreign budget, money to other countries, to ask countries to basically provide security intel on citizens and former vice presidents, candidates, to actively pursue foreign countries to play a role in your elections. So it's not an unserious charge, but certainly one of the things that people like Trump and his supporters, they love to play the victim. And this will probably end up galvanising his support, at least within his base in the run-up to the election. The US is also still on a bit of a boost, an economic boost, following a real clear upward trajectory started under the Obama years. So there's also a bit of a feel-good factor, like in certain parts of the economy. People who maybe come from that Rust Belt communities, as they call them, they might see that this is a guy. We've seen the economy improve under him. This is our guy. He's looking out for us. And these kind of people from the swamp, as Trump calls it, they might be given this impression that this is some sort of politically motivated attack, and it might be the thing that is, at least the timing, you could argue is politically convenient, but he was the one that wanted to find evidence at the time of an election, so of course there isn't really any other time that it's going to come up. But I'm not sure that that there's going to be any outcome and that it's going to have any bearing on the actual election itself.
It will be interesting going forward. The Democratic debates, the sixth Democratic debate happens tomorrow night, so it will be interesting to see how the other candidates do respond. Back in Scotland, though, applications are open for a new national pilot scheme intended to help first-time buyers with the deposit for a new home. The Scottish Government's First Home Fund aims to make the housing market fairer by providing a total of £150 million until March 2021 to help at least 6,000 people to buy their first home. Existing schemes have helped more than 32,000 households in Scotland buy their own home since 2007, particularly those aged under 35. So, as again somebody under 35, what do you make of this policy from the Scottish Government?
I remember being in the hall actually in Edinburgh when this was announced earlier this year, and just thought it was absolutely amazing. It's the kind of help that people have been crying out for, certainly of my generation. Following the crash in 2008, it became a lot harder to get property because it was what happened in America. It was a mortgage related crash, and it became extremely hard for people to get on the housing ladder ever since that time, the deposits actually required shot hugely up in value. And of course, housing prices as well are astronomical compared to what they've been in previous decades as well. So there's been not a lot of help, I have to say, up front. There have been some schemes, of course, like Help to Buy ISAs, etc. What's really encouraging is that this actually can work with such a scheme. So if you're in a position that you can make some savings in a kind of Help to Buy ISA, that you can also combine that support from the Scottish Government. But providing this as a loan, it really reduces that barrier to entry, which is so important. And it's also, at the moment, I think it's 6,000 loans that are available in the first release. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that that's completely taken up pretty quickly, and that there'll be a need for more. But it's completely positive news. It's something that should have, could have happened a long time ago, at a UK level. And I think it's great that the Scottish Government have been able to put forward something which is really helpful, bold and progressive measure that will really be of great help for someone like myself. And actually I think there's another component to this as well, because whilst it's great that it will help everyone, for some people who don't have that family support, people who come from a care background or estranged, or they just don't have the economic support for help from family, that's going to be a hugely important thing, because those people don't necessarily have someone that they can get a wee loan from their parents or something. Yeah. So really this is something that is going to be a huge help to those people as well.
Yeah, I think probably we just have to watch that it doesn't get taken advantage of by people who do have the resources. I mean, that's always the risk with any of these kind of things. But just finally though, almost 50,000 children are already benefiting from an expansion of funded early learning and childcare. From August 2020, the amount of funded learning and care for 3 and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds is being nearly doubled from 600 hours a year to 1,140 hours. New figures show that more than 1 in 3 children are now getting extra early learning ahead of next summer, allowing parents and carers more flexibility to work and study. The figures also show that 273 infrastructure projects have been completed since March 2018, comprising new builds, extensions and refurbishments to accommodate the kids during those extra hours. The latest figures were published following a meeting of the Early Learning and Childcare Expansion Programme Joint Delivery Board, jointly chaired by the Children's Minister Marie Todd and COSLA Children and Young People spokesperson Stephen McCabe. So, I mean, this is pretty good news as well, isn't it?
It's funny, because we hear so much from the opposition parties saying that, we're obsessed with independence and we need to get on with the day job. Well, actually, the fact is, of course, giving Scotland a choice on Brexit and on its future for independence is hugely important, and it's a major priority of the government. But, aside from that, the Scottish Government is leading the most progressive legislative programme anywhere in the UK of any government, including the UK government. And this is a really great example of life-changing policies that are being enacted that are extremely progressive, bold, that are being implemented, and not just a manifesto that's not going to be actually put into practice, but is something that has probably inspired manifestos elsewhere, I would say, but is actually something that is really changing people's lives while the other parties are in chaos, and the UK continues to look in chaos. But perhaps and hopefully we can set an example to the rest of the UK and others.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, Gary, we are all out of time. Time has flown by this last hour. So thank you very much, Gary, for joining us. Thank you to you at home as well for joining us. It's always a pleasure to produce the show for you. If you are able to donate to us, if you're able to help pay the bills here, then we would love for you to do that. You can go to broadcastingscotland.scot/donate. You can see that address along the bottom of the screen right now. Your contributions make all the difference, just first of all keeping the lights on here, but secondly to just to expand the kind of programs that we can do. There's a lot of things we'd love to do if we had the resources. So if you're able to support, as I say, do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/donate. Your money can make all the difference to what we can do here. If you're not able to afford it though, please don't worry, please don't feel bad. The shows will always be available for free to view online. So you know, this is the intention is to be for all of Scotland, and it just means that some of us have to chip in a wee bit more so that everybody can benefit. That's kind of how society works. But thank you again to Gary, thank you to you for joining us. We will be back again tomorrow night with Gordon for Scotland at 7. But in the meantime, I've been Kenny McBride. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.